Imagine that you had to solve a maddening riddle. It was a riddle of escape. Everywhere you looked, your world was closing in. You were in a strange country. You were far away from your home. And you just knew, that if you stayed there, if you stayed where you were, you would die. But you couldn't just leave. You see, the world around you was changing very quickly. You couldn't stop those changes from happening. But you could just try to escape. This was the world of Pesla Lewin in May 1940. Pesla Lewin and her husband had fled to Lithuania, to a city called Kaunas. Their home was in Poland. They were in Lithuania, but German armies had seized their home, and as Jews, they were among some of the fortunate to have escaped Poland. But Kaunas was not safe either. Not anymore. Without even leaving her front door, Pesla Lewin had just entered the Soviet Union, or perhaps more accurately, the Soviet Union had come to her. The Red Army marched into Lithuania and toppled the government, declaring that Lithuania would now become part of the workers' paradise. There in Kaunas, as a stranger, Pesla Lewin found herself in an ever-shrinking world. And it seemed like perhaps there was nothing she could do to escape. And Pesla Lewin was not alone. Also in Kaunas, there was a man named Zorak Warhaftig. Warhaftig, like Pesla Lewin, was also a stranger in Kaunas. He too had fled from Poland, escaping just ahead of Germany's blitzkrieg attack on that country. And although he had escaped German-occupied Poland and the fate of millions of Jews there under National Socialism, Warhaftig pondered the irony of his fate there in Kaunas. While freed from National Socialism, Warhaftig realized, we have been sentenced to life imprisonment under Joseph Stalin. Only Warhaftig? You see, he was no ordinary stranger. Warhaftig was a man of vision and will. He was a lawyer by profession, and he was also a remarkable community organizer. When Warhaftig spoke, many listened to him. Warhaftig was also the kind of man who only said things that were true. He dreamt of creating a homeland for all Jews in a place called Palestine at the time. And Warhaftig would eventually become an original signer of Israel's Declaration of Independence, a member of the newly established Knesset of Israel, and a two-time Israeli cabinet minister in a country that he had helped to create. But all of that was a very, very long way away. For now, Warhaftig was just a displaced refugee from Poland living in Lithuania that summer of 1940. And Warhaftig could see what was coming. There in Lithuania, Warhaftig calculated, quite correctly, that the uneasy peace made possible through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, well, that peace was not going to last. And when that peace eventually broke, Warhaftig believed that the Baltic states, well, they too would come under German control, just like Poland. That meant that all Jews in Lithuania, where Warhaftig was, would suffer the same fate of all Jews in Poland. All Jews in Lithuania had to escape now, as Warhaftig saw it. And so, there too in Kaunas, he too was pondering the same riddle of escape. Only, unlike Warhaftig, Pesla Lewin was already ahead of him, and perhaps she had a key to escape. It was a lockpick, really. You see, Pesla, yes, she was a Polish citizen. She took on Polish citizenship after she married her husband, but originally Pesla was Dutch. That was the key. You see, in order for Pesla or Warhaftig or anyone else to escape Lithuania in the summer of 1940, they needed to possess 4 pieces of paper. Think of these as gates that blocked their escape. The first piece of paper, the first gate, was proof of a national identity. This was a passport or other form of national ID. The second was an exit visa from the USSR. Remember, now that the Soviet Union had taken over Lithuania, it was part of the workers' paradise, and no one could leave without permission. The third was a transit visa. This gave you permission to travel across someone else's country on your way to a destination. The final gate, that final piece of paper, was an end visa. This gave you permission to arrive at your intended destination. Pesla Lewin worked through this riddle of escape, and she started at the very end. Yes, she was Polish, but Pesla Lewin also used to be Dutch, and all around the world, the Dutch government still held colonial possessions. Many of these were in Asia and the Caribbean. These colonies were very far removed from Europe and, more importantly, far beyond the reach of German National Socialist control. One of these places was a small Caribbean island called Curacao. It was a Dutch colony located about 50 miles off the coast of Venezuela in South America. For Pesla Lewin, Curacao, it was much more than an island, however. It was an overlooked paperclip in a prison cell. Perhaps it might be fashioned into a lockpick? So Pesla started her escape plan. In the very first week of July, 1940, Pesla Lewin wrote a brief letter of inquiry and addressed it to the acting consul of the Netherlands in Kaunas. Pesla Lewin didn't know it yet, but the man that she was writing to was an accidental diplomat. His name was Jan Zwardendig, and Jan Zwardendig was having a very, very bad month. Zwardendig had never come to Lithuania to be a diplomat. He had come to sell radio equipment for the Dutch Philips Radio Company. And then, back in May 1940, the Germans had invaded his country and shut down the sale of Philips radios in Lithuania as a result. Now in Kaunas, Zwardendig had watched the Germans occupy his homeland, the Netherlands. The Free Dutch government had relocated itself to London, along with the Dutch Queen, and they set up shop in these cramped London offices in a place called Stratton House in central London. It was here in Stratton House, in London, where 300 Dutch officials attempted to manage the country's far-flung colonies and reassemble the pieces of a functioning diplomatic corps. And then the Red Army invaded Lithuania 1 month later. No, this was not how Zwardendig's job was supposed to go. When he was originally offered the job to serve as a part-time diplomat in Kaunas, the early pitch seemed much more appealing. The man who had made this initial offer was the Dutch ambassador to the Baltic states, located in Riga, Latvia, nearby. He was a fellow named L.J.P. de Decker. Now, de Decker had informed Zwardendig that the portfolio of consul there in Lithuania, well, it wouldn't require much. In fact, Zwardendig could continue to sell radios for the Dutch Philips Radio Company and run the consulate out of his corporate offices there in Kaunas. Maybe he might have to handle a lost passport from a tourist from time to time, but overall, the job would not be a burdensome one. And if he did have any questions, all he had to do was send the good old Ambassador de Decker a note, and he'd get an answer. De Decker needed a good man, a Dutch man, there in Lithuania to serve as acting consul, and as far as de Decker was concerned, Zwardendig was the right man for the job. And then the whole world went to hell. Germany invaded Poland, Germany invaded the Netherlands, the Red Army marched into Lithuania, and Zvardendik's world was now upside down. Worse yet, his time as a diplomat was coming to an end. Moscow had informed all diplomats operating in Lithuania that their services would no longer be required. All diplomatic relations with the world would now be handled through Moscow. Zvardendik needed to close up shop and end his time in Lithuania. And in that upside-down moment fluttered out Pesla Lewin's letter. Opening it, Zvardendik read Pesla's inquiry. She was a Polish citizen who used to be a Dutch citizen, and she was very keen to receive an entry visa to Curacao. Well, okay, this was what Zvardendik had signed up for. He only had a few more weeks left as a diplomat, but until that time ended, he had to do his job. Only he had no idea what the visa requirements for Curacao might be. So, he decided to write his boss. From the Dutch embassy in Riga, Latvia, the old ambassador reviewed the note from his acting consul there in Kaunas, and he answered it accurately. They didn't issue visas to foreigners for Curacao. The local governor on the island had the exclusive power to allow anyone to land, especially Jewish refugees from Lithuania, and this was a power which he never used. Refugees were never allowed to land on Curacao. All right, well, that was a tidy response. Zvardendik conveyed the unfortunate news to Pesla Lewin. And Pesla? Well, for Pesla, this was very bad news. It seemed like her lockpick was not going to work. She would not be able to open one of those gates to escape. But for Pesla Lewin, her husband, and her family, this was a matter of life or death. And Pesla Lewin was not going to take no for an answer. So she went over Zvardendik's head, and she wrote his boss. Little did Pesla Lewin know that Zvardendik was simply conveying the bad news from his boss. But she typed out a second letter and sent it directly to Ambassador de Decker there in Riga. And de Decker sent her back the same unfortunate, very bad news. Imagine Pesla reading the bad news for the second time, and then her flash of inspiration. It was that single line, "Visas are not required." This meant, in Pesla Lewin's mind, that her lockpick might still work. Pesla promptly sent a second note back to de Decker and inquired if he would simply write that phrase on her passport. Also, Pesla Lewin finally came clean. She explained that she didn't really need to go to Curacao in the West Indies. All she wanted was to get out of Lithuania. Would the ambassador write that phrase, "No visas are required," on her passport? Now, de Decker was a very experienced diplomat. He had served all around the world. He understood the subtlety and nuance of diplomatic language, and he understood also the rules. What Lewin was asking him to do was, in the nicest terms, a diplomatic sleight of hand. In more accurate terms, she was asking him to commit a fraud. What's more, de Decker had no responsibility, no obligation to do this for Pesla Lewin. But he was also a man who understood how the world worked. He understood also how the world was changing. And although he died shortly after the war ended and took to the grave his own internal thinking, his own reasoning, once he saw Pesla's plea, we can perceive that de Decker also saw the fate that was awaiting all Jews in Europe and all Jews in Lithuania and the Baltic states. While we don't know de Decker's internal thoughts, we do have his letter back to Lewin. It said simply, "Send me your passport." And when Pesla Lewin received her passport back from Riga, it had a handwritten note, inscribed in French by de Decker, and it read, for the admission of aliens to Suriname, Curacao, and other Dutch possessions of the Americas, an entry visa is not required. The inscription was dated July 11, 1940, and De Decker had just removed one of the 4 requirements to escape Lithuania. This was big. So, right after that, Tesla's husband Isaac, he went to the Kaunas offices of Jan Zwardendik there at the corporate headquarters of the Philips Radio Company, and he had both his passport and the passport of his wife, which had De Decker's handwritten note on it. That note saying that visas to Curacao are not required, and he asked Zwardendik to write the exact same note onto his passport. Zwardendik agreed, and word began to spread throughout the Jewish community there in Kaunas. The Dutch consulate was writing visa exemptions for Curacao. Perhaps Zwardendik thought that this would be his last act as consul there in Kaunas, but if he did, he would have been very, very wrong. Shortly thereafter, a fellow named Nathan Gutwerth and a colleague of his, both were students at a local yeshiva, they arrived in Zvardendik's offices and they said, it's very interesting. We're Dutch citizens and we've decided that we want to go on a vacation to the Caribbean island of Curacao. However, this is very curious, but we have a lot of friends at our yeshiva, and, they're not Dutch citizens, but they've decided that they want to join us on this vacation to Curacao, and while we'd ask you to write the same note about visas not being required in our documents, because we're Dutch citizens, perhaps, as the Dutch consul, you would write that same note in the identity papers of citizens who weren't Dutch? Well, there was no way that Zwardendik would have been remotely fooled by this very thin cover story about a vacation to Curacao from these yeshiva students, but it didn't matter. Jan Zwardendik agreed, and so he too inscribed the same note into the 2 Dutch yeshiva students' papers and said he would do the same for all of their friends who also wanted to go on vacation to Curacao. How many do you need? Gutwerth said, let me find out. And just like that, Pesla Lewin had unlocked one of the gates with her paperclip. And word then started to spread very quickly throughout Kaunas and the larger Jewish community located in Lithuania, and it got the attention of our man Zvarak Varhaftig. As I said, he was a man of very clear vision and will, and he could see the writing on the wall. Any Jew who stayed in Lithuania would likely die. And as a result, with this news about visas in Curacao, Varhaftig began to plan his exodus. The only question was, where the heck was Curacao? Well, as one yeshiva student recalls, with Varhaftig, they pulled out this very large map of the world, they found Curacao, and they plotted how they would get there. For anyone looking to get to Curacao at the time, you had to cross the entirety of the Soviet Union by train and make your way to the Pacific port of Vladivostok. From there you would travel to Japan, and from there you would take a boat to the Panama Canal. Boats did not travel regularly from Lithuania to Curacao, so they had to go the long way around in order to get to their destination. But it was possible, and that for Varhaftig was the key. So he started to bring together other rabbis and leaders of Lithuania's Jewish community and tell them about this potential escape route, this potential exodus out of the Soviet Union to freedom. And he had a very big sit-down with many senior rabbis. He said, "We are sitting on a volcano between Germany and the Soviet Union. We must escape." In 1940, Zvarak Varhaftig had correctly identified that Lithuania was located in what American historian Timothy Snyder would eventually call the Bloodlands of Europe. Situated on the plains and forests between Berlin and Moscow, countries like Lithuania, well, they were about to become a place where, and to quote Snyder here, 14 million people, including more than 5 million Jews, were killed. At the time, few people, perhaps not even Zwarhaftig, could have conceived of the scale of human slaughter that was about to be unleashed in Central and Eastern Europe. And that also helps to explain why some of the local rabbis there in Kaunas were not entirely convinced by Zwarhaftig's plan for an exodus, his plea that they all must escape. Besides, Jewish communities had faced persecution in the past. They had suffered through pogroms. They had experienced anti-Semitism. And many thought that the best course of action was not to gamble on some risky scheme that Zwarhaftig was cooking up about visas to Curacao. No, the best course of action was to hunker down, shelter in place, and ride out the storm. Even if not everyone was convinced by Zwarhaftig, he was a very powerful speaker and community organizer, and he attracted the attention of the head of one of the most prestigious and well-known yeshivas of the day, the Mir Yeshiva, which had recently relocated to Lithuania. The members of the Mir Yeshiva, they believed in Zwarhaftig's plan, they agreed with him, and they would join his exodus. So, shortly after, Nathan Gutfeld returned to Zwardendig's office with a number. It was the number of visas that he needed Zwardendig to write. The number was 200. Gutfeld needed 200 visas for Zwarhaftig, others who were going to join him, and all the students of the Mir Yeshiva. They were all going to leave. Except they had only unlocked one of the gates. 3 gates still remained closed to them, and they had to move very, very quickly if they were going to make the most of this opportunity. So, what happened next? How did they escape the Soviet Union and manage to cross Japanese-controlled territory in the Far East? And what would remain of Lithuania and the vibrant Jewish community and culture that had existed prior to the war? This incredible story of freedom is just too big, too grand in scale to squeeze into one single segment. So, on our next segment, we will finish this incredible journey in 1940 to escape the Bloodlands of Europe. Now, do you love freedom and fellowship and discovering the story behind the story of some of the biggest events in world history? I'd ask you to show just how much you love freedom by subscribing to this channel for more stories of freedom with Peter Doran, and join us over at Locals, where I have weekly live chats and Twitter spaces with subscribers. I hope to see you there.